welcome to the Swiss Connection. I'm Susan Misicka. Is Facebook a threat to democracy? Are nuclear weapons really banned? And is humanitarian aid broken? Now, these are the kinds of questions that a colleague of mine tries to answer on her podcast. If you didn't know it, Swiss Info actually has two English language podcasts. There's this one, and there's Inside Geneva, which is hosted by Imogen Foulkes. And I've got her in the studio with me today. Welcome, Imogen.
Hi, Susan. Nice to be here.
Now, in addition to podcasting and writing for Swiss Info, you are also a correspondent for the BBC. Can you tell us a little bit about your work there?
Well, that's right. I'm the BBC's Switzerland and Geneva correspondent. So it is what it says. I cover the country and I cover the United Nations in Geneva and all the humanitarian work and diplomacy that goes on there.
Now, on your show, Inside Geneva, of course, Geneva is great fodder for material, being the location for so many international organizations, as you said, the UN, the Red Cross. And what about the format of your show? How does it work?
So Inside Geneva is a podcast which normally takes three guests in a roundtable discussion, lasts about half an hour. We kind of take a deep dive into the subjects that I'm covering for the news, like what are they doing on human rights? What's the aid access to Syria like? We take a critical look, actually, at humanitarian work, too. We've looked at institutional racism in aid agencies, for example. And sometimes the format is different. It's more of a documentary. For that, we've looked at treaties. We've got a mini-series called Treaties That Changed Our World. So we've looked at very recently, very new treaty just this year, the one that says that nuclear weapons are banned and that no country should ever use them.
Never use them. Of course, they might have them, but are they really banned?
Under UN international law, yes, they are. But of course, the big nuclear powers did not ratify this treaty. That doesn't mean it's not law. It is. They still have them. The idea of this treaty at this point, I think, is to put pressure, to show that there is a consensus among the world's nations that these weapons we should not have. We should not stockpile them. We should not make them or sell them. And we should certainly never use them. It's going to take a while, but the Landmines Treaty took a while. Still, the big powers haven't signed that, but basically nobody is using them now.
So you're saying there's hope then for this nuclear ban?
I think we all need to hope so. I mean, the very fact that it was pushed through by smaller non-nuclear nations who used their right as UN member states to get this treaty through. So the ambassador from Costa Rica, a wonderful lady who's interviewed in the podcast, who guided it through. And they have a completely different vision, but one we should perhaps listen to for the world. You know, we don't need to spend so much on defence. Not everybody will agree, but enough agreed to pass this treaty. And that does, I think, set a marker to the entire planet.
Well, speaking of listening, I think we should have a listen to that episode. Thanks for joining us and introducing it, Imogen.
You're welcome.
The ban on nuclear weapons became law in January, 76 years after the first and only time nuclear weapons were actually used by the United States on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the days that followed August 6, 1945, the world was initially unaware of what exactly had happened, but the International Committee of the Red Cross, in Japan in the hopes of visiting prisoners of war, sent a delegate to Hiroshima to find out. Cordula Droege, legal officer with the ICRC, told me more.
The ICRC was present in Hiroshima in August of 1945, not immediately on 6th of August, but soon thereafter, and so witnessed firsthand the complete devastation of this city. And what happened is our delegate, Marcel Junot, in Tokyo, and he received this telegram from his colleague, Fritz Bilfinger, who was in Hiroshima, saying the city is devastated.
Visited Hiroshima 30th. Situation horrifying. 80% of town razed. All hospitals destroyed or severely damaged. Have visited 2 provisional hospitals. Conditions indescribable. bomb effects surprisingly severe. Many victims, apparently recovering, suddenly experience fatal relapse owing to the degeneration of white corpuscles and other internal injuries.
Most of the doctors have died and nurses. The conditions are beyond description. And so Junot got on the plane and then brought relief into the city at that time. And then immediately thereafter called for banning these nuclear weapons, having witnessed the consequence of them in the city of Hiroshima, which he said, it's flattened like the palm of a hand.
-10. Miles back, observers from all services and several allied nations stand by for the first...
The ICRC immediately called for a ban, but instead the big world powers settled into a race for the new weapons. Hundreds of nuclear tests of bigger and bigger bombs were carried out.
The Nevada desert in America is the scene of the latest atomic test.
People around the world were instructed on how to cope.
Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes.
We all, somehow, learned to live with the threat of global destruction.
First, you duck, and then you cover. You duck and cover.
This acceptance of what was in reality a terrifyingly unacceptable situation was, says Beatrice Fihn, part of the problem. She is executive director of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, an organisation founded in 2007. Its mission, to persuade the world that living with weapons of mass destruction need not be inevitable.
When you talk about nuclear disarmament and eliminating nuclear weapons, the first reaction people have is that, oh, yeah, those are really horrible weapons. And a lot of people have, might not know a lot about nuclear weapons, but in comparison to other weapons, there's an awareness of the horror of it, the mushroom cloud, total devastation, end of the world kind of scenarios. But there's also sort of that follow-up comment immediately about, but it's never going to happen. There's a recognition that these are horrible and we need to do something about it, but a hopelessness, I think, in people that thinking that we can't do anything about it. So I'm very often met, not by actual resistance to what we're trying to do, but more this kind of general sense that it's out of our hands and we can't do anything about it. And I think that that's really where ICAN has its most potential and powers, is to inspire the people that believe in this issue and agree with us to actually feel like they could contribute and do something.
And the campaign itself, when you started, obviously this is something you have to get member states on board. How hard was that? Were there people you just thought there's no point in even talking to them, or how did it go?
The world was quite different. And it's quite interesting now to think about just 10 years back in time. Obama and Medvedev had signed the New START treaty. There was this sense of optimism in a way in 2011, 2012, we were going somewhere better. It didn't start this treaty as a reaction to everything bad that was happening, rather that there was an opportunity here. And maybe this is a moment where we could really push for something. And I think that one of the challenges we faced early was more, well, things are fine now. Why would we need to care about this issue? Is this really a problem? Whereas fast forward, throughout these Trump and Putin years, people have been more, oh my God, they might press the button soon. It's really quite urgent. So it was definitely a collaboration early on with governments. And so some of them were easy to convince. Some of them were quite difficult. It took a long time before it became an issue that the governments were comfortable talking about in public. I think a lot of governments weren't comfortable saying right out loud, right? We're going to ban nuclear weapons, and we're going to do it with or without the nuclear arms states on board, and this is the new thing that we're doing. So that took several years to get governments brave enough to express it publicly. But once they started doing that, we sort of had this cascade of support.
For the ICRC, ICAN's emergence was good news. Finally, an official campaign for a United Nations treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. The ICRC works in war zones. It is pragmatic about the fact that wars will happen, and it certainly does not call for a ban on all weapons. But this one, says Cordula Droege, really should not exist.
There are ethical reasons, moral reasons, humanitarian reasons, and legal reasons. The immense suffering caused by those weapons. Now, all wars cause suffering, there's no question about it. But there are some weapons that are so abhorrent to humanity and the principles of public conscience that the ICRC has called for their ban on the basis of the suffering that they cause. And the ICRC, of course, is also the guardian of international humanitarian law. And all weapons, including nuclear weapons, in armed conflict have to abide by the principles of distinction, which is to distinguish between combatants and civilians and military objects and civilian objects, the principle of proportionality, which requires that there shouldn't be excessive civilian harm in armed conflict. Now, nuclear weapons in particular fall short of all of those principles because a nuclear weapons detonation will cause immediate effects that are so widespread, so strong, that they will cause indiscriminate death and injury amongst military and civilians. When you read, for instance, the description about the weapon in Hiroshima, you have the blast that was about 2 kilometers wide, which flattened everything around it. And then for miles and miles beyond, the city was destroyed. Now, nuclear weapons that we have today have partly 10 times more power than the weapon like in Hiroshima. So they will flatten entire cities. They will pollute the land, the soil, the water, which all will have consequences on the suffering of not only the military, but also civilians. And again, they cannot be contained in time. And this is also important. The Japanese Red Cross in its hospitals still today, 75 years later, treats people who are suffering illness or cancer from the effects of the Hiroshima bombings and Nagasaki bombings.
Was it a war crime, dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima?
That's a good question, and it's very difficult to assess this with hindsight. I mean, it wasn't considered a war crime at that time. Today, if you deliberately commit an indiscriminate targeting, then it would amount to a war crime in an international armed conflict. So I think today there's a great chance that the use of a nuclear weapon, which would be deliberately indiscriminate, would constitute a war crime.
The next step in the campaign was to find a diplomat to steer the treaty negotiations through the United Nations.
I am Elaine Whyte. I am a diplomat from Costa Rica. I had the great honor and privilege to negotiate the treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons.
Elaine Whyte Gomez was Costa Rica's ambassador to the UN in Geneva. Her country abolished its armed forces in 1948. Ever since, promoting peace and disarmament has been a key pillar of Costa Rica's foreign policy. Guiding the nuclear ban treaty through the UN was, she remembers, a natural fit.
We were approached to ask if Costa Rica was willing to take up this role. And then I think there were two considerations. First of all, of course, we had to analyze all of the circumstances. It was a challenging, very challenging endeavor. It is the first time in the UN history that a formal process of the UN unfolds with the direct opposition of the P5. But I tell you that, of course, we went through everything and all the considerations. And one, we understood that we could not shy away from that responsibility because it was something that we would have failed the Costa Rican society if we would not have taken on board that responsibility.
Were you personally daunted at all, thinking, I'm going to take this on?
No. On the personal level, your persona knows that, you're going to go through a very important challenge in your life. But I felt very, very secure because I have the complete back of my government. So I felt very grounded. But there was something that did change the process in me. It is that I was able to go to Nagasaki. I had been in Japan before, but I had never been in Hiroshima or in Nagasaki. And I have to tell you, that changed me. And that gave me an internal strength that I would not have had if I had not gone and seen and experienced with my human part of this diplomatic operator.
The campaign began to gather strength. In 2017, ICANN received the world's top award for peace.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2017 to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICANN.
There to accept the award was Setsuko Thurlow, one of the last remaining survivors of Hiroshima.
I was just 13 years old girl when the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on my city of Hiroshima. I remember that morning vividly. At 8:15, I saw a blinding bluish-white flash.
Her description at the Nobel ceremony of that day in 1945 was watched by millions.
I saw all around me utter, unrecognizable, unimaginable devastation. Procession of ghostly figures shuffled by. Grotesquely wounded people, they were bleeding, burned, blackened, and swollen. Parts of their bodies were missing. Flesh and skin hung from their bones.
For Cordula Droege, this was an important moment to remind the world of the horrific effects of nuclear weapons, because in 2017, the policy of mutually assured destruction and that fragile consensus that no one should strike first had begun to erode. It was a dangerous moment.
You have voices saying, maybe we can use tactical nuclear weapons. And, the first strike, so the taboo against the use of a nuclear weapon as a first strike was being put into question. You have an upgrading and modernization of nuclear weapons arsenals instead of disarmament. And so while in the disarmament and non-proliferation obligations, you have an obligation to work towards an elimination of nuclear weapons. This isn't happening at the moment. You have 13,000 nuclear weapons, many of which have higher yields than the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And many of those are on high alert status, so they can be triggered really at, in a matter of seconds. So this is all very worrying. And if this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons can strengthen the taboo and again trigger a motivation of nuclear weapon states, but also the states that have agreements with the nuclear weapon states and are under the so-called nuclear umbrella, to double their efforts, to make more efforts for disarmament and non-proliferation and the gradual elimination of nuclear weapons, that is already a success.
I now declare the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons open for signature.
At the United Nations, Elaine Whyte Gomez's diplomacy was paying off. In July 2017, the draft treaty was presented for member states' adoption.
The most important moment, of course, was the adoption itself of the treaty. There was such energy in that room. But for me, also, how the screen that shows the voting, I did not have it in front of me. It was a little bit on my side. So when I turned around and I looked at the 122, in that moment I burst in emotion, because that is a very strong mandate.
122 of the UN's 193 members approved the draft treaty. Next step, signing it. After that, ratification.
Well, the world is one step closer to banning nuclear arms. Honduras has just become the 50th country to ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. That means that the treaty will now come into force in 90 days.
With 50 states ratifying it, the treaty abolishing nuclear weapons, their use, their production, their stockpiling, came into force in January of this year. But there's an elephant in the room. Not a single nuclear power has ratified it, and so the treaty doesn't apply to them. ICANN's Beatrice Fihn explains.
Of course, the treaty is not solving these issues already. And as all international law, it's not quick fixes, and it doesn't work instantaneously. And that's one of the challenges for international law and multilateralism in general, I think, that media works very fast. People are very sort of short attention spans these days, and they want to see results immediately. And that's not how international law works. It works over time. You can see it over decades. You can see how incredibly powerful the shifts of behavior can be in many cases. And so really what we're hoping is that this treaty will start changing things for the long term, in the way that the Bioweapons Convention, the ban on chemical weapons, have really shifted how we think about those weapons.
Some people might ask, though, with this treaty, which I would imagine 99.9% of your ordinary citizens on this planet would say, great, but it's a treaty which applies to the signatories. Nuclear weapons are outlawed for people who have signed this treaty, but the states who have nuclear weapons haven't signed it. So people will say, well, isn't that a bit illogical? And what can it actually achieve if nuclear weapons are only illegal for states who don't have them?
That reaction is very, very common and something that we hear all the time. But I think that when people start thinking about it in detail, how these things work, the fact that the international law, even if it doesn't apply to all countries, now has this line in the sand that these weapons are illegal. It's a huge thing, and it really is going to kind of shift the burden onto those that are outside the norm. And we've seen that with human rights treaties, for example. We've seen that with the Chemical Weapons Convention. I mean, Syria, Assad used chemical weapons in Syria. Nobody said that was okay just because they hadn't joined the treaty, right? They were banned under international law. This is a bad weapon. And in people's minds and the sort of norms in society say that chemical weapons is a bad thing. So of course, you can't force countries to do something. And I think that's the whole idea behind the international law, is to create the incentives to behave in a certain way. Like the US, Russia, China, they didn't sign the landmines ban, they didn't sign the cluster munitions ban. But the way these weapons have been drastically reduced, stockpiles have been eliminated, the use of them have almost stopped. And you can see how even countries that haven't signed the treaties are shifting their behavior. The US is almost following the landmines ban, even if they haven't formally signed it. There are no more American producers of cluster munitions, because the companies in the United States that make these weapons, and they are not too concerned about humanitarian issues, right? They're weapons companies. But even they said it's not a sustainable business idea anymore because it's banned under international law. So the idea behind the treaty is to kind of turn up the pressure on the nuclear armed states and make it more difficult to maintain and continue to have nuclear weapons. They will disarm when it's in their interest to do so. So basically what we're trying to do is to create more incentives and make it harder to maintain them, right? Make it complicated, difficult. They have to defend it at every UN body. They have to be sort of feel like it's a constant burden to have it. And thereby created, an easier setting for the US Congress to say, why are we spending gazillions of dollars on this weapon when we're in a pandemic? The rest of the world has banned them and they get really annoyed with us. And the UK can do similar things, and France and China and Russia will do similar things. And we've seen it in the past that it actually works.
Elaine Whyte Gomez agrees. We may not see results overnight, but this treaty will, bit by bit, change perceptions of what is acceptable. History, she points out, has precedents for this.
The big question is, how long does it take for a treaty to render the first results? What is the time frame that you can expect a treaty to actually see the first results? In this case, the first contribution of the treaty is its normative force. First time in history, you have this vehicle in which you articulate that nuclear weapons are illegal and illegitimate. So this normative force is going to go deeply into societies and in the interaction of states, the discussions of states. And when I address this issue of the time frame or the impact of the treaty, I like to bring historic examples that the international community has gone through in dealing with some scourges. For instance, slavery was considered legitimate for centuries. How many norms and how many actions were needed to be taken so that there was a point in history in which we no longer considered, or the international community no longer considered that slavery was legitimate because it was illegal, because it was illegitimate, but also because societies change.
I realize the tragic significance of the atomic bomb. Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it.
For the ICRC, which campaigned from the start for a ban, the treaty is a real cause for celebration. Cordula Droege again.
Very much. Very pleased. And we are really celebrating. And we're celebrating this as a historical moment, actually. Even 10, 15 years ago, the idea that you could have this treaty was, very unlikely. You also have to celebrate it as a victory, particularly for the hibakusha, the victims of these nuclear bombings who campaigned for this for 75 years, and very few of them, but some of them can still see this victory and are celebrating it. That doesn't mean it's now the end of nuclear weapons. I think we can't be naive about this, but it sets a milestone where we have a benchmark which all states have to acknowledge.
Last time we talked about treaties on Inside Geneva, we looked at the Ottawa Convention on Landmines, a treaty that has, in the 22 years since it came into force, truly changed our world and saved countless lives. The nuclear ban has only just come into force, and like the Ottawa Convention, the big powers haven't ratified it. But if history is anything to go by, we have reason to hope that the coming years will see, at last, a real move away from nuclear weapons and the nightmare scenario of our own destruction. That brings us to the end of this edition of Inside Geneva. My thanks to Cordula Droege of the ICRC, Beatrice Fihn of ICANN, and Ambassador Elaine Whyte Gomez. A reminder, you've been listening to Inside Geneva from SwissInfo. You can hear more by going to our website, swissinfo.ch, including several episodes which have charted our path through the pandemic over the last year. We explore other key humanitarian challenges too, from the future of the United Nations to the war in Syria, and of course, you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Imogen Foulkes. Thank you again for listening.
A big thank you to my colleague, Imogen Foulkes, for telling us about her show, Inside Geneva. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And also, please leave us a 5-star review. We love hearing from you. I'm Susan Misicka. Talk to you again soon.
Do you want to polish your knowledge about Swiss elections, referendums, and political parties, while at the same time learning more about the quirks of the political system in Switzerland? If that's the case, our newsletter course is just what you need. Each week for a month, we'll send you a free installment explaining the most important details of how Swiss democracy works. Our course teaches you who's eligible to vote in Switzerland, what the different parties stand for, how election and popular vote results are implemented, and what distinguishes Swiss democracy from other political systems. Our crash course is interactive, like democracy itself. Your questions will be answered on an FAQ page, and you can debate with other users and share your inputs and opinions. We will also provide links to multimedia articles and videos to help you better understand the Swiss democratic system. Please join us and sign up for the free Democracy Crash Course newsletter at www.swissinfo.ch/democracy. That's www.swissinfo.ch/democracy.